My husband said, "I love you," to someone who wasn't me. It was my best friend of 11 years, and they were planning how to tell me about their 6-month affair. She had been asking me for marriage advice while secretly stealing my husband behind my back. They both went silent when they saw me standing in the doorway listening to everything. The worst part is, that wasn't even the biggest secret they were hiding. My name is Jessica, and I'm 29 years old. I thought I had everything figured out in my life until 6 months ago, when my entire world came crashing down in the most devastating way possible. I discovered that my husband of 4 years has been having an affair with my best friend since college, and the betrayal has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about love, friendship, and trust. I've been married to David for 4 years, and we've been together for a total of 7 years. We met in college through mutual friends and had what I always considered to be a fairy tale romance. David is 31, works as a marketing manager for a tech company, and has always been the kind of husband that my friends would compliment me on having. He's handsome, successful, attentive, and until recently, I believed he was completely devoted to our marriage. My best friend Mindy has been in my life for even longer than David. We met during our freshman year of college and instantly bonded over our shared love of terrible reality TV shows and our dreams of traveling the world together. Mindy is 28, works as a freelance graphic designer, and has been like a sister to me for the past 11 years. She was my maid of honor at my wedding, the first person I called when I got promoted at work, and the friend I turned to for advice about everything from career decisions to marriage problems. Mindy and David have obviously known each other for as long as David and I have been together. The three of us have always been close, often hanging out together as a group, going on double dates when Mindy was seeing someone, and celebrating holidays and special occasions together. Mindy has been over to our house countless times, has a spare key for emergencies, and David has always treated her like the sister he never had. Or at least, that's what I thought until I discovered the truth about their relationship. Looking back now, there were warning signs that I completely missed or rationalized away because I trusted both of them so completely. About 8 months ago, I started noticing that David seemed to be texting more frequently than usual. He'd always been someone who stayed connected with friends and coworkers throughout the day, but lately he seemed to be constantly checking his phone and would sometimes smile at messages in a way that seemed different from his usual casual texting. When I'd ask who he was talking to, David would usually say it was work-related or mention a friend's name casually. Sometimes he'd say he was texting Mindy about plans we were making or about something funny that had happened. Since Mindy and I texted frequently throughout the day anyway, it didn't seem unusual that David might also be in touch with her occasionally. I also started noticing that David seemed to know details about Mindy's life that I didn't know, or that he'd mentioned things about her before I'd heard them from her directly. For example, he'd mentioned that Mindy was thinking about taking a pottery class, and when I'd ask her about it later, she'd seem surprised that David had told me. Or he'd know that she'd had a difficult client meeting before she'd had a chance to tell me about it herself. At the time, I attributed these things to the fact that we all hung out together frequently, and I assumed Mindy must have mentioned these details when I wasn't paying close attention or when I was distracted by something else. It never occurred to me that David and Mindy might be having private conversations that didn't include me. About 6 months ago, I started noticing that Mindy seemed different when the three of us were together. She'd always been comfortable and natural around David, treating him like a brother-in-law and joking around with him the way she did with me. But lately, there seemed to be a tension or awkwardness that hadn't been there before. Mindy would sometimes seem nervous or fidgety when David was around, and I'd catch her looking at him when she thought I wasn't watching. She'd also sometimes make comments about David that seemed overly complimentary or personal, like commenting on his new haircut or mentioning how hard he'd been working lately. Again, I didn't think much of it at the time because Mindy had always been someone who noticed details about people and was generous with compliments. I also noticed that Mindy had started canceling plans with me more frequently, usually at the last minute and often with vague excuses about work projects or family obligations. Mindy had always been reliable about our friendship and rarely canceled plans unless something serious came up. When I'd suggest rescheduling, she'd sometimes seem hesitant, or would say she wasn't sure when she'd be free again. Around the same time, David started working late more often, and would sometimes say he was going out for drinks with coworkers after work. He'd always been social with his work friends, so this didn't seem unusual, but the frequency seemed to increase significantly. When he'd come home from these supposed work events, he'd sometimes seem distracted or would take a shower immediately, saying he smelled like the bar or restaurant. The first real red flag came about 4 months ago when I was planning a surprise birthday party for Mindy. I wanted to coordinate with David to make sure he could attend and to get his input on gift ideas. When I started talking to him about the party planning, David seemed to know more details about Mindy's preferences and interests than I expected. For example, when I mentioned that I was thinking about getting Mindy a necklace, David immediately suggested a specific style that he said she'd been admiring recently. When I asked how he knew that, he said Mindy had mentioned it when we were all out to dinner the week before, but I couldn't remember her mentioning jewelry at all during that dinner, and I'd been paying attention to the conversation. David also seemed to know that Mindy had been wanting to try a specific restaurant that had just opened downtown. When I asked how he knew about her interest in that restaurant, he said she'd mentioned it in passing, but Mindy hadn't mentioned the restaurant to me, and it seemed odd that she'd bring it up randomly to David. I started paying more attention to the interactions between David and Mindy when we were all together. I noticed that they seemed to have inside jokes or references that I didn't understand. They'd sometimes exchange looks or smiles that seemed to exclude me from whatever they were thinking about. When I'd ask what was funny, they'd usually say it was nothing important or would explain it in a way that didn't seem to capture whatever had actually amused them. I also noticed that David and Mindy seemed to know each other's schedules better than I would have expected. David would sometimes mention that Mindy was busy with a project on a specific day, even though she hadn't told me about it. Or Mindy would know that David had an important meeting coming up that I didn't know about. When I'd ask how they knew these details about each other's lives, they'd usually say they'd mentioned it briefly at some point when we were all together. The second major red flag came about 3 months ago when I decided to surprise David at his office with lunch. I'd been feeling like we hadn't been spending enough quality time together, and I thought it would be nice to have an impromptu lunch date. When I arrived at his office, his assistant told me that David had left about an hour earlier and hadn't mentioned when he'd be back. I called David's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I waited in the parking lot for about 30 minutes, thinking he might just be running a quick errand and would return soon. When he didn't come back, I decided to drive home and surprise him there instead. But when I got home, David wasn't there either. I tried calling David again, and this time he answered. He sounded surprised to hear from me and seemed flustered when I told him I'd been to his office. He said he'd had to leave unexpectedly to handle a client emergency and was currently in a meeting at a coffee shop across town. When I offered to bring him lunch at the coffee shop, he said the meeting was almost over and he'd just grab something quick before heading back to the office. David came home that evening at his usual time and mentioned that he'd had a busy day with unexpected client issues. He seemed normal and didn't act like anything unusual had happened. But something about the phone conversation had bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what felt off about his explanation. A few days later, I was talking to Mindy about my week and mentioned that I'd tried to surprise David with lunch, but he'd been in an unexpected client meeting. Mindy made a comment about how stressful David's job had been lately and said she felt bad for both of us having to deal with his demanding schedule. But then she mentioned specific details about David's work stress that seemed more detailed than what I'd shared with her. When I asked Mindy how she knew so much about David's current work situation, she said he'd mentioned it when we'd all been together recently, but I couldn't remember David going into that much detail about work when the three of us were hanging out. We usually talked about lighter topics when we were socializing together, and David typically didn't bring up work stress unless something major was happening. About 2 months ago, I started noticing that David's behavior at home had changed in subtle ways. He seemed more distracted and would sometimes zone out during conversations. He'd also started taking his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom or when he was doing yard work. Previously, David had been casual about leaving his phone around the house and had never been secretive about his messages or calls. David also started being more critical of small things around the house or would seem irritated by habits of mine that had never bothered him before. For example, he'd make comments about how I loaded the dishwasher or would seem annoyed if I wanted to watch a TV show that he didn't enjoy. These weren't major conflicts, but there was a tension in our daily interactions that hadn't been there before. Around the same time, I noticed that Mindy seemed to be going through some kind of emotional situation that she wasn't sharing with me. She'd sometimes seem distracted or emotional when we'd hang out, but when I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd say she was just stressed about work or family stuff. Mindy had always been open with me about her problems, so her vagueness seemed uncharacteristic. Mindy also started asking more questions about my marriage and my relationship with David. She'd ask things like whether David and I were happy, whether we were thinking about having kids soon, or whether we ever fought about serious things. These questions seemed to come out of nowhere and felt more invasive than Mindy's usual interest in my life. The most concerning conversation happened when Mindy asked me whether I thought David and I would ever get divorced. When I asked why she was asking such a serious question, Mindy said she'd been thinking about marriage in general and wondering how people know when a relationship is worth fighting for. She said she'd been observing different couples and trying to understand what made some marriages work while others fell apart. The conversation made me uncomfortable because it felt like Mindy was analyzing my marriage in a way that seemed inappropriate. I told her that David and I were committed to each other and that while we had normal relationship challenges, we were happy and had no intention of getting divorced. Mindy seemed almost disappointed by my answer, which struck me as a strange reaction from someone who was supposed to be my best friend. About 6 weeks ago, I had to travel for work for 3 days. David seemed supportive about the trip and helped me pack and prepare for the presentation I'd be giving. He told me he'd miss me but would keep busy with work and probably hang out with friends while I was gone. I thought it was sweet that he'd miss me, and I was looking forward to getting back home to him. While I was traveling, David and I texted throughout each day as we usually did when one of us was away. He'd send me pictures of his meals, updates about his day, and sweet messages saying he was counting down the days until I got home. Everything seemed completely normal, and I felt grateful to have such a loving and attentive husband. On the last day of my trip, I decided to come home a few hours earlier than I'd originally planned. My presentation had gone well, and I was able to catch an earlier flight that would get me home by mid-afternoon instead of evening. I was excited to surprise David and thought it would be romantic to show up unexpectedly. I didn't tell David about the change in my travel plans because I wanted the surprise to be complete. I took a cab from the airport and was giddy with anticipation about seeing the look on his face when I walked through the door. I was planning to suggest that we go out for a nice dinner to celebrate my successful work trip and to reconnect after our few days apart. When I got home and opened the front door, I immediately heard voices coming from the living room. I assumed David had a friend over and was looking forward to saying hello before the friend left so David and I could have some alone time. But as I got closer to the living room, I recognized the voice that was talking with David. It was Mindy. I was surprised that Mindy was at our house in the middle of a weekday afternoon, but I figured maybe she'd stopped by to drop something off or had needed David's help with something. Mindy had a key to our house and had been over countless times, so her presence wasn't necessarily unusual, but something about the tone of their conversation made me pause before entering the room. I could hear David and Mindy talking in low, intimate voices that sounded different from their usual casual friendship banter. They were speaking quietly, as if they were sharing secrets or having a private conversation that they didn't want anyone else to hear. I stood in the hallway for a moment trying to understand what they were discussing and why they sounded so serious. What I heard next completely shattered my world and changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my best friendship. Mindy was telling David that she was tired of sneaking around and wanted to tell me the truth about their relationship. David was saying that they needed to be careful about time and that he wasn't ready to hurt me yet. Mindy said that she felt guilty every time she looked at me and that she couldn't keep pretending to be my friend while she was in love with my husband. David responded that he was struggling with the same guilt, but that he wasn't ready to give up what they had together. He said that he'd never felt about anyone the way he felt about Mindy and that he couldn't imagine his life without her. I stood frozen in the hallway, unable to process what I was hearing. My husband and my best friend were discussing their secret relationship and how to handle the fact that they were betraying. The two people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me and carrying on behind my back while I remained completely oblivious to their deception. I heard Mindy tell David that she loved him and that she wanted to be with him openly instead of having to hide their relationship. David said that he loved her too and that he'd been thinking about how to end his marriage with me. They talked about how difficult it would be to tell me the truth, but agreed that they couldn't continue living the lie indefinitely. The betrayal was so overwhelming that I felt physically sick. I quietly backed away from the living and went outside to sit in my car and try to process what I just discovered. My hands were shaking and I felt like I might throw up. Everything I thought I knew about my life had just been revealed to be a complete lie. I sat in my car for over an hour, crying and trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to storm back into the house and confront them immediately. Another part of me wanted to pretend I'd never heard the conversation and try to go back to the way things were before, but I knew that I could never unknow what I'd just learned about David and Mindy's betrayal. I also realized that I needed to be smart about how I handled the situation. If David and Mindy had been having an affair for months, there was probably evidence of their relationship that I could gather before confronting them. I decided to go to a coffee shop and think through my options before going back home and pretending that nothing had happened. When I finally returned home about 2 hours later, I acted as if I'd just arrived from the airport as originally planned. Mindy was gone, and David was in his home office working on his laptop. He seemed genuinely happy to see me and gave me a big hug and kiss, telling me how much he'd missed me and asking about my trip. David's affectionate greeting felt like another betrayal, knowing that he'd been discussing ending our marriage just hours earlier. I managed to act normal and told him about my presentation flirtation and the meetings I'd attended. We ordered takeout for dinner and spent the evening catching up, with David being attentive and loving in all the ways that had made me fall for him years earlier. That night, as David slept next to me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My husband of 4 years had been having an affair with my best friend of 11 years. The two most important relationships in my life were both based on lies and deception. I started thinking back through recent months and reinterpreting events and conversations in light of what I now knew. All of those times when David seemed to know details about Mindy's life made sense now. They were having private conversations and probably seeing each other regularly without my knowledge. All of those times when Mindy seemed awkward or nervous around David made sense too. She was struggling with the guilt of betraying me while maintaining the facade of friendship. The next morning, I waited until David left for work and then began my investigation into the extent of their relationship. I started by going through David's laptop and phone to see if I could find evidence of their affair. I felt terrible about violating his privacy, but I needed to understand how long this had been going on and how serious their relationship was. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. David and Mindy had been exchanging intimate text messages for over 6 months. The messages started out relatively innocent, with Mindy texting David about small things and David responding in a friendly way. But over time, the messages became more personal and flirtatious. I found messages where they talked about how much they enjoyed spending time together and how they felt a special connection that was different from their relationships with other people. There were messages where they discussed how guilty they felt about their growing feelings for each other and how they didn't want to hurt me but couldn't seem to stay away from each other. The messages became explicitly romantic and flirty about 4 months ago. I found conversations where they told each other they were falling in love and where they made plans to meet secretly when I wasn't around. There were messages sent during times when I thought David was at work or when Mindy had canceled plans with me, showing that they were using those opportunities to be together. I also found photos that they'd sent to each other, including intimate pictures that made it clear they were having a physical relationship. The photos were taken in locations I didn't recognize, suggesting that they were meeting at hotels or other places specifically to avoid being seen together. One of the most painful discoveries was a series of messages where David and Mindy discussed their future together. They talked about how they wished they could be open about their relationship and fantasized about what it would be like to live together as a couple. Mindy wrote about how she imagined traveling with David and building a life with him. David responded that he thought about the same things and that he'd never been happier than he was when he was with her. They also discussed practical aspects of ending my marriage with David. Mindy had researched divorce laws and had found information about how property and assets would be divided. David had looked into the cost of renting an apartment where he could live while the divorce was being finalized. They were actively planning to destroy my marriage and had been researching the logistics for months. I found evidence that David and Mindy had been meeting regularly for secret dates. There were messages where they planned romantic dinners at restaurants across town, weekend getaways to nearby cities when I thought David was attending work conferences, and regular afternoon meetings at Mindy's apartment when I was at work. The timeline showed that their relationship had become serious very quickly. Within 2 months of their first flirtatious messages, they were telling each other they were in love. Within 3 months, they were having sex regularly and talking about a future together. Within 4 months, they were discussing how to end my marriage so they could be together openly. I also discovered that Mindy had been lying to me about much more than just her relationship with David. She'd been canceling plans with me not because of work or family obligations, but because she was spending that time with David instead. She'd been asking me questions about my marriage not out of general curiosity, but because she was trying to find weaknesses or problems that would justify her affair with my husband. Most painfully, I found messages where Mindy and David discussed me directly. They talked about how naive I was for not suspecting anything, and how easy it had been to carry on their affair right under my nose. Mindy wrote about how she felt guilty sometimes, but that her feelings for David were stronger than her loyalty to our friendship. David responded that he cared about me, but had never felt passion for me the way he felt it for Mindy. Reading those messages was like being stabbed in the heart repeatedly. The two people I loved most in the world had been mocking my trust and discussing how clueless I was about their betrayal. They'd been laughing about how easy it was to deceive me while I continued to love and support both of them unconditionally. I spent the entire day reading through months of messages and looking at photos and evidence of their affair. By the time David came home from work that evening, I had a complete understanding of the scope and timeline of their relationship. I knew exactly how long they'd been betraying me, how often they'd been meeting secretly, and how serious their plans were for a future together. That evening, I acted completely normal with David. We had dinner together, watched TV, and went to bed as if nothing had changed. But inside, I was devastated and furious. I felt like I was living with a stranger who had been expertly manipulating me for months while carrying on a passionate affair with my best friend. I decided that I needed to gather more evidence before confronting them, so I spent the next several days pretending that everything was normal while secretly documenting their affair. I took screenshots of their text messages and saved them to a private email account. I made copies of photos and created a timeline of their relationship that showed exactly when different milestones had occurred. I also started paying closer attention to their behavior when we were all together. Now that I knew about their affair, their interactions seemed obvious and blatant. They would touch each other casually in ways that seemed inappropriate, would exchange meaningful looks across the room, and would sometimes have private conversations that excluded me. During this time, Mindy continued to act like my best friend, calling me regularly and making plans to hang out. She'd ask me about my marriage and offer advice about my relationship with David, all while knowing that she was actively working to destroy that marriage. The level of deception and manipulation was breathtaking. David also continued to act like a loving husband, bringing me flowers, planning date nights, and telling me he loved me. He'd kiss me goodbye every morning and hello every evening, all while knowing that he was planning to leave me for my best friend. The cognitive dissonance of his behavior was almost impossible to comprehend. About 2 weeks after discovering their affair, I decided it was time to confront them. I'd gathered enough evidence to prove what they'd been doing, and I couldn't continue living the lie any longer. The stress of pretending everything was normal while knowing the truth was making me physically and emotionally sick. I decided to confront them together so they couldn't coordinate their stories or try to minimize what they'd been doing. I invited Mindy over for dinner on a Friday evening, telling her that I wanted to have a fun girls' night with her and David. Mindy seemed excited about the invitation and said she was looking forward to spending time with both of us. When Mindy arrived that evening, she brought a bottle of wine and seemed to be in a great mood. She hugged both David and me and settled in for what she thought would be a normal social evening. David was also relaxed and happy, probably looking forward to spending time with both the woman he was married to and the woman he was in love with. We had a normal dinner with casual conversation about work, current events, and upcoming weekend plans. Mindy and David interacted the way they always did when I I was around. Friendly and comfortable, but not obviously romantic. If I hadn't known about their affair, I never would have suspected anything based on their behavior that evening. After dinner, I suggested we move to the living room for dessert and wine. Once we were all settled, I took a deep breath and told them that I had something important to discuss with both of them. They both looked curious and attentive, probably expecting me to share news about work or announce plans for a vacation or celebration. Instead, I told them that I knew about their affair and had evidence of their relationship going back 6 months. The looks on their faces were a mixture of shock, panic, and guilt. Mindy immediately started crying, and David went completely pale. Neither of them tried to deny what I was saying, which confirmed that my accusations were accurate. I told them that I'd found their text messages, photos, and evidence of their secret meetings. I discovered their plans to end my marriage and their discussions about building a future together. I knew about the lies they'd been telling and the way they'd been mocking my trust behind my back. Mindy broke down completely and kept apologizing through her tears. She said she never meant for it to happen and that she tried to fight her feelings for David. She claimed that she loved me as a friend and had never wanted to hurt me, but that her feelings for David had been too strong to resist. David was initially silent and seemed to be trying to figure out how to respond. When he finally spoke, he didn't try to deny the affair or make excuses. He said that he was sorry I'd found out the way I did and that he'd been planning to tell me about his relationship with Mindy soon. He claimed that he'd fallen out of love with me gradually and had found something with Mindy that he'd never experienced before. I told them both that I felt completely betrayed and devastated by their deception. I'd trusted them both completely and had never suspected that they were capable of such elaborate lies and manipulation. I said that they'd both destroyed the most important relationships in my life and had shown me that I couldn't trust my own judgment about people. Mindy begged me to forgive her and said that she wanted to try to repair our friendship. She claimed that her relationship with David didn't have to mean the end of our friendship and that she hoped we could work through the situation together. She seemed to genuinely believe that I might be willing to accept their relationship and maintain a friendship with her despite her betrayal. David was more direct about his intentions. He said that he wanted to end our marriage and be with Mindy openly. He claimed that he'd been unhappy in our marriage for longer than I'd realized and that meeting Mindy had shown him what he'd been missing. He said he hoped we could divorce amicably and that maybe we could even remain friends eventually. I was amazed by their selfishness and lack of understanding about the magnitude of what they'd done to me. Mindy seemed to think that our friendship could survive her affair with my husband, and David seemed to think that I'd be willing to facilitate a smooth transition so he could be with the woman he'd chosen over me. I told them both that they'd lost the right to have any expectations about my forgiveness or cooperation. I said that Mindy was no longer my friend, and that I never wanted to see her again. I told David that I wanted him to move out of our house immediately, and that I'd be filing for divorce as soon as possible. Mindy became hysterical and begged me to reconsider ending our friendship. She said that she understood I was hurt and angry, but that she hoped I'd be able to forgive her eventually. She claimed that she'd been planning to end the affair and try to repair our friendship, which was obviously a lie given the evidence I'd found about their future plans. David seemed almost relieved that the secret was finally out in the open. He said that he was sorry the situation had been so painful for me, but that he was glad he could finally be honest about his feelings. He actually seemed to expect me to be understanding about his decision to leave me for my best friend. I told them both to leave my house immediately and that I didn't want to discuss the situation further until I'd had time to process what they'd done and decide how to move forward. Mindy continued crying and apologizing as she gathered her things, while David packed a bag and said he'd stay at a hotel until he could find an apartment. After they left, I sat alone in my house and tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. In the span of one evening, I'd lost my husband of 4 years and my best friend of 11 years. The two most important relationships in my life had been revealed to be based on lies and deception. The next few weeks were the most difficult period of my life. I had to tell my family and friends about David's affair and our upcoming divorce. I had to explain to people who knew and loved Mindy why she was no longer part of my life. I had to deal with the practical aspects of separating my life from David's, while also processing the emotional trauma of his betrayal. My family was incredibly supportive and expressed shock that David and Mindy had been capable of such deception. My parents had always liked David and had considered Mindy to be like another daughter, so they were devastated to learn about the affair. My sister was furious on my behalf and offered to help me with anything I needed during the divorce process. My other friends were also shocked and supportive. Many of them had socialized with David and Mindy regularly and had never suspected anything unusual about their relationship. Several friends mentioned that they'd thought David and I had a strong marriage and were surprised to learn that he'd been unhappy enough to have an affair. The hardest part was explaining the situation to mutual friends who were close to both Mindy and me. Some of these friends felt torn about taking sides and seemed to want to maintain relationships with both of us. I had to make it clear that I wouldn't be able to continue friendships with people who chose to remain close to Mindy after learning about her betrayal. The divorce process was complicated by the fact that David wanted to move in with Mindy immediately. I learned that they'd already been looking at apartments together and had made plans to start their new life as soon as our marriage was officially over. The speed with which they moved forward with their relationship made it clear that they'd been planning their future together for much longer than they'd initially admitted. I hired a lawyer who specialized in divorce cases involving infidelity and worked to protect my financial interests during the separation. Fortunately, David was cooperative about the practical aspects of the divorce and didn't try to fight me for assets or property. He seemed eager to finalize the divorce quickly so he could start his new life with Mindy without any complications. The emotional recovery was much more difficult than the legal process. I had to rebuild my entire social life and support system after losing both my husband and my best friend. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma and learned about the psychological impact of discovering infidelity and losing multiple important relationships simultaneously. The therapist helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of complex grief. I wasn't just mourning the end of my marriage, but also the loss of my best friendship and the destruction of my ability to trust people I'd considered completely reliable. The betrayal had shaken my fundamental beliefs about love, loyalty, and my ability to judge people's character. I also had to deal with practical challenges like finding new social activities and building new friendships. Mindy and I had shared many mutual friends and activities, so I had to figure out how to maintain those relationships and interests without running into her. I joined new groups and started new hobbies to build a social life that didn't include reminders of our former friendship. About 3 months after the confrontation, I learned that David and Mindy had moved in together and were telling people they were engaged. The speed of their relationship progression confirmed that they'd been planning their future together much longer than they'd admitted. They seemed to have no shame about the way their relationship had started or the pain they'd caused. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Mindy had been trying to portray their affair as a love story that couldn't be helped. She'd apparently been telling people that she and David had fallen fallen in love despite trying to fight their feelings, and that their connection was too strong to ignore. She seemed to have rewritten the history of their relationship to make herself feel better about the betrayal. David had apparently told people that our marriage had been struggling for years, and that he'd found happiness with Mindy that he'd never experienced with me. This was particularly painful because it wasn't true. Our marriage had been strong and happy until he'd started his affair. He was rewriting our history to justify his choices and make his betrayal seem more acceptable. Learning about their engagement was another devastating blow, even though I'd expected it would happen eventually. The fact that they were planning to build a life together while I was still dealing with the trauma of their betrayal felt like an additional insult. They were moving forward with their happiness while I was still trying to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I started dating again. It was terrifying to try to trust someone new after experiencing such a complete betrayal from the two people I trusted most. I was hypervigilant about red flags and found myself constantly questioning whether new romantic interests were being honest with me. My first few dating experiences were unsuccessful because I couldn't relax enough to enjoy getting to know someone new. I was so afraid of being deceived again that I couldn't allow myself to be vulnerable or open with potential partners. The betrayal had damaged my ability to trust not just romantic partners, but also my own judgment about people's character and intentions. The therapist helped me work through my trust issues and develop strategies for dating that felt safe while still allowing for genuine connection. I learned to communicate my concerns directly with new partners and to look for consistent behavior over time rather than making quick judgments based on initial impressions. About a year after my divorce, I met someone new who was patient with my trust issues and understanding about my previous experiences with betrayal. We took our relationship very slowly and built trust gradually through consistent, honest communication. Having a healthy relationship helped me realize that not everyone was capable of the kind of elaborate deception that David and Mindy had practiced. I also learned that I was stronger and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. Surviving the betrayal and rebuilding my life had given me confidence in my ability to handle difficult situations and advocate for myself. While I wouldn't choose to go through the experience again, it had taught me valuable lessons about setting boundaries, trusting my instincts, and recognizing my own worth. 2 years after the affair was discovered, I heard that David and Mindy had gotten married. I felt sad for a moment, but realized that I no longer felt devastated by news about their relationship. I'd built a new life that was fulfilling and happy, and their choices no longer had the power to destroy my emotional well-being. I'd also developed a new understanding of friendship and what it meant to trust someone completely. I was more selective about the people I allowed into my inner circle and paid closer attention to consistency between people's words and actions. I valued friends who demonstrated loyalty and honesty through their behavior over time, rather than just through their declarations of friendship. The experience taught me that some betrayals are so fundamental that they can't be forgiven or overcome. While I'd healed from the trauma of discovering the affair, I could never trust either David or Mindy again. They'd shown me that they were capable of elaborate deception and manipulation, and that knowledge couldn't be unknown or ignored. I also learned that healing from betrayal takes much longer than most people expect. The initial shock and devastation lasted for months, but the deeper work of rebuilding trust and confidence took years. Even now, several years later, I sometimes have moments of doubt or hypervigilance in my relationships that can be traced back to the trauma of discovering the affair. But I also learned that it's possible to build a life that's even better than what was lost through betrayal. My new relationships are built on a foundation of more mature communication and mutual respect. I'm more confident in my ability to advocate for myself and less willing to ignore red flags or rationalize concerning behavior. The most important lesson I learned was that other people's choices about how to treat me say nothing about my worth or value as a person. David and Mindy's betrayal was about their character flaws and moral failures, not about any inadequacy on my part. I'd spent months wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could have prevented their affair, but eventually I realized that their choices were entirely their own responsibility. Looking back now, I can see that there were probably signs of David's capacity for deception that I'd missed or ignored during our dating years. He'd always been charming and charismatic, but I now recognize that those same qualities that had attracted me to him also made him skilled at manipulation. He'd been able to lie convincingly to my face for months, while maintaining the appearance of being a loving, devoted husband. Mindy's betrayal was in some ways even more painful than David's, because I'd trusted her with intimate details about my marriage and my insecurities. She'd used that knowledge to her advantage while pretending to support me as a friend. She'd been there for me during difficult times in my life, offering comfort and advice, all while planning to steal my husband and destroy my marriage. The affair also taught me about the importance of maintaining individual identity and interest within a marriage. I realized that I'd become somewhat isolated socially, because David and I had spent most of our free time together, or with mutual friends like Mindy. When the marriage ended, I found myself without a strong, independent social network, which made the recovery process more difficult. I made a commitment to myself that any future relationship would include space for individual friendships and activities. I wanted to make sure that I never again put myself in a position where losing a romantic partner would mean losing my entire social support system. This lesson served me well in my subsequent relationships and made me a more confident, independent partner. About 3 years after the divorce, I was contacted by a woman named Michelle, who told me that David had been having an affair with her while he was married to Mindy. Michelle had discovered evidence of David's infidelity and was reaching out to me because she wanted to understand if this was a pattern of behavior for him. Learning about David's second affair confirmed what I'd suspected about his character. He wasn't someone who'd made a one-time mistake with Mindy, but rather someone who was fundamentally dishonest and unfaithful. The affair with me hadn't been a unique love story that couldn't be helped, but rather the behavior of someone who was incapable of maintaining fidelity in any relationship. Michelle told me that David had used many of the same tactics with her that he'd apparently used with Mindy. He'd been secretive about his phone and computer, had lied about working late, and had made her feel like their relationship was a special connection that transcended normal moral boundaries. The similarities were striking and showed that David had a practiced approach to conducting affairs. I felt vindicated by this information because it confirmed that my marriage hadn't failed due to any inadequacy on my part. David was simply someone who was incapable of being faithful to any partner, regardless of how loving or supportive they were. Mindy was probably experiencing the same betrayal that I had, which gave me a strange sense of justice. Michelle also told me that Mindy had been devastated by David's second affair and was apparently struggling with the same feelings of betrayal and confusion that I'd experienced. Mindy had apparently told mutual friends that she couldn't understand how David could cheat on her after everything they'd been through to be together. The irony of Mindy's situation wasn't lost on me. She'd believed that her relationship with David was special and unique, and that their connection was stronger than his marriage to me. But David had proven that he was equally capable of betraying her, regardless of how their relationship had started, or what what they'd sacrifice to be together. I decided not to reach out to Mindy during her crisis, even though part of me felt sorry for what she was experiencing. While I could empathize with the pain of discovering a partner's infidelity, I couldn't forget that she'd been an active participant in destroying my marriage. Her current suffering didn't erase the pain she'd caused me or make her betrayal any less devastating. The information about David's pattern of infidelity also helped me feel more confident about my decision to end our marriage, rather than trying to work through his affair. Some people had suggested that I should have tried couples counseling or given David a second chance, but learning about his subsequent behavior confirmed that he wasn't someone who was capable of change or genuine remorse. About 4 years after my divorce, I married my current husband, James, who I'd met through a hiking group I'd joined as part of rebuilding my social life. James knew about my previous experiences with betrayal and was patient and understanding about my trust issues. He consistently demonstrated his commitment through his actions and was transparent about all aspects of his life. Our relationship was built on a foundation of open communication and mutual respect that I'd never experienced in my marriage to David. James and I talked openly about our expectations, boundaries, and concerns from the very beginning of our relationship. We built trust gradually through consistent behavior rather than through grand gestures or declarations. The contrast between my relationships with David and James helped me understand what healthy partnership actually looked like. With David, I'd been so focused on maintaining harmony and avoiding conflict that I'd ignored warning signs and accepted behavior that wasn't actually acceptable. With James, I felt comfortable expressing my needs and concerns directly, which led to better communication and stronger trust. I also learned to recognize the difference between secrecy and privacy in relationships. David had been secretive about his activities and communications in ways that were designed to hide dishonest behavior. James maintained appropriate privacy about some aspects of his life while being completely transparent about anything that affected our relationship. About 5 years after the affair was discovered, I heard through mutual acquaintances that David and Mindy had divorced after his second affair was discovered. Mindy had apparently filed for divorce immediately and had been unwilling to consider reconciliation. She'd learned the same lesson I had about David's character, but it had taken her several years longer to reach that understanding. I felt sad for Mindy in some ways because I knew how devastating it was to discover that someone you loved and trusted was capable of such elaborate deception. But I also felt that she'd received appropriate consequences for her role in destroying my marriage. She'd gotten exactly what she'd fought so hard to have, a relationship with David, and had learned firsthand why that relationship wasn't worth the pain she'd caused. The news of their divorce also brought closure to a chapter of my life that had been painful for so long. David and Mindy's fairy tale romance had turned out to be just as illusory as my marriage to David had been. Their relationship hadn't been the special, unbreakable connection they'd believed it was, but rather another example of David's inability to maintain faithful, honest relationships. Looking back now, almost 6 years after discovering the affair, I can honestly say that my life is better than it was when I was married to David. I have a healthier, more honest relationship with James, stronger friendships built on mutual trust and respect, and greater confidence in my ability to recognize and respond to problematic behavior. The experience of surviving betrayal and rebuilding my life taught me that I'm much stronger and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. I learned that I could handle devastating loss and still find happiness again. I discovered that I could trust my instincts and advocate for myself even when doing so was difficult or painful. I also learned valuable lessons about the nature of love and commitment that have made me a better partner in my current marriage. I understand now that real love requires consistent action and demonstrated commitment, not just feelings or declarations. I know that healthy relationships require honesty, transparency, and mutual respect, even when those things are difficult to maintain. The betrayal by David and Mindy was one of the most painful experiences of my life, but it was also one of the most educational. It taught me about my own strength, about what I wanted in relationships, and about the importance of surrounding myself with people who shared my values about loyalty and honesty. If I could go back and prevent the affair from happening, I'm not sure I would. While the experience was devastating, it ultimately led me to a much better life with a partner who truly deserves my trust and love. The pain was temporary, but the lessons and growth have been permanent and valuable. My advice to anyone who discovers that their partner is having an affair with someone they trust is to remember that the betrayal says nothing about your worth as a person. Both the cheating partner and the affair partner have made choices that reflect their character, not your inadequacy. You deserve relationships built on honesty, loyalty, and mutual respect, and you have the strength to rebuild your life in a way that honors those values. The most important thing I learned from this experience is that some people are simply not capable of the kind of love and commitment that healthy relationships require. David and Mindy showed me through their actions that they valued their own desires more than honesty, loyalty, or the well-being of people who loved them. That knowledge was painful but ultimately liberating because it freed me to find relationships with people who shared my values and were capable of genuine love and commitment. Today, I'm grateful for the life I've built with James and for the friendships I've developed with people who have consistently demonstrated their trustworthiness over time. I've learned to value consistency over charisma, honesty over charm, and demonstrated commitment over passionate declarations. These lessons have served me well in all areas of my life and have helped me build relationships that are truly fulfilling and sustainable. The affair that seemed like it would destroy my life ultimately became the catalyst for creating a much better one. While I would never wish that kind of betrayal on anyone, I'm grateful for the strength, wisdom, and clarity it brought to my life. Sometimes the most painful experiences teach us the most valuable lessons and lead us to the happiness we were always meant to find.